So I really want to talk about open source, and of course there's been a debate in some quarters about open source drives innovation in AI. Other people say, well, we like the closed source model for in terms of security and compliance, we want to control it, among other things. What's your take in terms of open source and AI versus the closed source model?
Yeah, so it's a very, very nuanced and complicated question. So I have strong opinions on the notion of open source models versus closed source models, and which one are winning out and for what purposes, et cetera. So I would tell you, and my personal opinion is I think open source models will ultimately win out in general. And there are a few different reasons as to why I believe that to be the case. So one of the things around the closed source models is they're heavily dependent on training, of course, for and so thinking about the data that's run on inferencing, is that getting sent back somewhere else and things like that? That becomes a really important piece that you have to consider. So when you talk about governance and security, is it actually more secure, or do you have more privacy with even proprietary models, right? So that's one of the things that I think has to be taken into consideration. Now, separate and distinct from that, the other thing about open source models that I think become interesting is what we've done at Cloudera is we've made it such that you can bring any model that you want and run it on your private data. So you're inferencing directly off of the data that you're running, and it's not sending any of that data training anywhere else. It's running directly inside of the Cloudera system, Cloudera AI, and running off the data directly. So we call it private AI. So Cloudera AI really enables private AI. Most of what we're doing is we're leveraging open source models. We do have partnerships with all of the major model providers like Anthropic, OpenAI, et cetera, But what our customers are doing is they are often using open models, open source models in particular, and running it off of their data in their deployment. So that's another piece of this. Then the third piece of this, and this is kind of where I think the market is going to ultimately drive the decision making and who the winners end up being. But in my opinion, I think the winners will ultimately be the open source models. And the reason why I believe that to be the case is if you think about kind of the economics behind models, model development and model training in particular, it's incredibly high. The switching cost is incredibly low.
The cost to build.
The cost to build a model is incredibly high. For the customer, the cost to switch is incredibly low from model to model, right? So it's not like you have to rewrite an application if you want to use another model. Most of the models today generally do basically the same things with very little differentiation in terms of performance, hallucinations, things like that. They're all basically able to get the job done. And so what I feel like is in the world of models, we've got all of these different model providers. It's kind of moved into a commodity at some level, which is very controversial to say, I know, and it's very contradictory. But I think as what's happened is become kind of a race to the bottom, right? Look at how much money OpenAI loses. I believe they lose about $5 billion a year, right? So you think about the expense relative to the revenue, and they generate multi-billions of revenue, but they still lose $5 billion a year, right? And so the point is, I think at the end of the day, the open source models will likely win out if there's not much differentiation that can be seen from model provider to model provider, right? And so that's why I think open source models will win out from a cost, from an economics perspective. And then I think open source models will actually, if you're running it specifically inside of your data and inside of your private or private AI effectively, then you don't necessarily send any data back for retraining or fine tuning or anything else back to the model provider, right? And so that for me is why I think, and why we here at Cloudera believe that the open source models will likely win out.
You know, I'm sure you probably would get some pushback, and other people would say, "Oh no, our model's built for this, and so it's really not interchangeable." And others would say, "No, I know you get some argument on that point."
I mean, I'm just giving you my personal opinion, but at the end of the day, I think what will happen for us, We are not super worried because we, as Cloudera, actually enable and work with every model provider out there, right? And so we want to ultimately leave it to the customers for their choice to ultimately choose what's the best model for their particular use case. Through our what we've enabled with our NVIDIA NIMS microservice, we partner with NVIDIA as part of our inferencing service. We're able to serve up all of the major models that are out there in the marketplace. And so we work with all of the major model providers that are out there that are optimized for the NVIDIA NIMS service as well. So we ultimately give the customers the choice as to what model makes the most sense. But at some level, even that too will start to get abstracted out, and they're going to say, I want a model that does this particular use case. And it'll automatically just come up with the right model, irrespective of which foundational model it's coming from.
That is pretty fascinating, the mix and match concept. What about open source and individual AI, ML use cases? Can you talk about how they enable the use cases in particular?
Yeah, sure. So the models that enable, so I'll give you some use cases that we have running inside of Cloudera and that we're enabling for some of our customers, right? So some of the big ones have been what I'd call mostly RAG-based use cases in particular. So we have customers, banking customers in particular, for customer support, customer service use cases that are basically getting to the chat prompt, asking for recommendations, for fixing things as it relates to voice to text, converting into basically the IVR from the phone, converting that into text, then from that text being able to come up with the next action or the recommendation directly off of that to the agent to actually provide feedback. So it's basically more of a RAG-based use case. We do have customers that are using that. Other use cases that we enable as well is basically talking to the data directly. So building visualizations on the fly based on actually querying, asking the questions of the data. I would like to know this, and then being able to see through data visualization. Similarly, we're starting to see this with copilots. So SQL copilots, developer copilots. With the SQL copilot, we're really excited about is it can help users who may not be specifically experts at SQL to query data and in natural language and return back a SQL query that can actually run and execute that query based on what they're trying to do, right? So these are some of the use cases that we have. We're using various models to actually enable those use cases. Most of the models that we use are actually open source models for those particular use cases that we're enabling in our platform. But yeah, a lot of cool and innovative things that are out there. And then I think that next evolution around agents as well. So we've created an agent studio that can help accelerate the building of agents for our customers as they want to orchestrate multiple action touch points across their ecosystem. I'll give you an example of an agent that we've started thinking about too. So, you think about the complex data and analytics landscape. And so a company that we recently acquired, we acquired a company called Octopi from a lineage perspective. And so you think about data lineage and you think about it coming from source all the way through to wherever it needs to go from a use case. So it goes into source. From the source, it's a transaction processing system. That data gets landed in somewhere like a data lake of some kind. You're running an ETL process on that data. That then serves that up to another engine that might be running it from a compute for BI purposes that might actually be pushing that out to a BI engine itself, like a Power BI or a Tableau or something like that, which is ultimately the end consumer of the original source of that data. So you think about all of the different steps, that goes through. And so what if you had an agent that could orchestrate that process end to end, that could then allow you to see that process end to end? And so that's one of the things that we're starting to think about is data pipelines being orchestrated by agents.
That's really interesting because I think about agents it's going to buy a refrigerator for me. It's going to do a series of tasks. I don't think about agents as the back office workers necessarily, but it makes perfect sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So think about how much, and think about that business process. It's a super complicated business process, right? You start from the input-output from a transaction processing system all the way out to some person needs to make decisions based off of that data that came from that transaction processing system in an analytics system, right? And then think about all the steps that it goes through, right, to get there,
Right.
to that decision, right? What if that could be orchestrated via an agent? And this is why, so think about when things happen from a lineage perspective. You know, what causes problems? What causes changes? Well, what usually causes changes on the front end is we add new features to applications. Well, what's a feature? Well, feature is really not a whole lot more than you add a new column with computation, right?
Okay.
That's effectively what a feature is, right? When you build a feature. It's new capability with functionality that's based off of a column in a database that has a calculated fields and features, right? Well, what happens downstream is if somebody doesn't know about that, it's going to break the report, it's going to break the ETL, it's going to break everything, right? So what if there was that ability to notify, update automatically through an agent, right? The ETL scripts and things like that. That we see could be the future of where computing, where the data space actually goes as well.